Psalm 60 is our reading today, and it's a desperate time for God's people Israel. They've been attacked by their enemies. Things are not looking good at all. And yet, as we read down through the psalm, we find that there's a greater enemy. Of course, it's the greater enemy that they say lurks within. People often, when I'm at different conferences and I meet up with other ministers, they say, what's the greatest encouragement for you at the moment? And sometimes some of them are a bit personal as well, and they say, and what's also the greatest discouragement? Well, the greatest discouragement for me is always the same. It's always me. I am my greatest discouragement. When I think of the things I do and say, and it isn't anyone else, it's the enemy within is the greatest problem. And this was a real tragedy with God's people. It seemed as though these different nations that were fighting them, attacking their land, were the big problem, when in fact they weren't. And God was even allowing that as a loving father to discipline them because of their own greater, bigger issues, of their hearts wandering from God and his ways. And yet David, of course, like he always does, and teaches us this wonderful, repetitive lesson in times of difficulty and trial, he turns to God. He turns and he pleads the cause of his nation and his people. And he cries out and he says in verse 5, "Save us and help us with your right hand, that those you love may be delivered." Tragically, even amongst the whole of God's nation, God's people, there were those that loved him and those that didn't. And so there were those that ultimately were judged and cast away from his presence. And yet there were those that were saved and protected. There were those that were forgiven their sins, where they went and asked God for mercy. It's just the same for us today, living as Christians 3,000 years on from this incident. Our greatest enemy is ourselves. And yet our greatest confidence is in asking God for mercy, knowing his forgiveness, and seeing and believing it wonderfully because of the cross of Jesus Christ. There our forgiveness is assured. There all our sin is dealt with, and we are protected. We're promised his presence. So let's rejoice in that. And let's see as well at times that our Father is only disciplining us for our own good, because he really does love us, because our hearts have wandered.